Hey guys, welcome to this episode of the In the Nick of Time podcast. Today we'll be joined by a special guest, Alex. But before we jump in, just want to introduce Christian's website again, gamertech.ca. You can use the promo code Nick to get a $25 discount on any computer components or accessories or any purchases you make on his site. Especially with COVID and such, supporting small businesses like his is very important in our current situation. But yeah, hey Alex, welcome on to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, so I know this is a special topic we're doing on mental health, but I just wanted to ask you to briefly introduce yourself. What is your connection with the mental health services, and yeah, just a general introduction for the audience so we can get to know you a bit better.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Alex Collier, and I am the founder and director for the board of a nonprofit called the Albertus Project. And the Albertus Project is a 501c3 nonprofit that focuses on educating people about addiction and also destigmatizing addiction in its entirety. We provide a lot of harm reduction services and are big advocates for the addiction community and the family and friends, realizing how important it is to support the family and friends of those who are also suffering. It's almost like a full-time job. But I founded this nonprofit back almost a year ago now. One of my best friends passed away on January 6th, unfortunately, from an overdose. And at that time, about a year ago, I legitimately didn't know the first thing about addiction. And I realized I was part of the problem. And that wasn't because I was, doing anything willfully, but I was blissfully ignorant. I didn't educate myself. I didn't know how to support my friend. I didn't know how to talk about it. And that's really the problem, right? Because addiction and mental health are very stigmatized topics, but addiction even more so. I find we are at the point in time where thankfully most people can talk about mental health, which is really great. But probably Nick, when you and I were growing up about 10 years ago, you couldn't. So we've made a lot of headway there. But addiction is one of those things that is still very difficult for people to come forward and talk about because they're shamed and they're blamed. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about addiction. It creates this huge stigma. So I am running this nonprofit to really help lift up the voices of those who are either in active addiction or in recovery and support the family and friends so we can start to create a community and we can start to move this conversation forward. And hopefully, no one will have to go through what I went through with one of my best friends.
For sure. And I am sorry to hear about your friend, but I know that many people do have such issues with any, they might see their friends currently, especially in COVID, face some addiction issues or family
Right.
members and such. And especially with it being the holidays and staying at home, it might affect them more directly. So,
Right.
briefly, before we go in any further, I just want to ask you, what are some things that you personally learned when not only with dealing with your friend's incident, but also in the organization itself? And also, what are some other stories that your organization did come through to actually help you learn and is still a vivid story that still is in your memory right now?
Yeah, you know what? I've learned so much. I think the tough part was when I was trying to understand addiction. I didn't understand anything. The only thing I knew about addiction was what people say, right? That it's that person's fault. They brought it onto themselves. I just didn't understand that addiction is an actual disease, right? I didn't understand how to talk and support someone. And, I think about it like this, right? With any sort of physical ailment, if someone has cancer, you don't say, oh, well, they're a cancer, right? Why do we say when someone is in active addiction, oh, well, they're an addict? They are way, way, way more than that. And I didn't really realize that. And I think there's a lot of things that we say, right? I never thought twice about using the term clean, for example. But using that word clean, that implies that the person who is in addiction is dirty, which is not something that we want to propagate. So I just learned how important it is to educate yourself. And I know I keep on saying that, but the more you educate yourself, the more likely you are to actually understand how difficult this is as a disease and how tough it is to get better. There are so many stories that I have received. We run something called Humans of Addiction, which takes after the awesome Humans of New York. And the whole point of that was people need their stories need to be told. And I'm lucky enough the Alberta's Project has been a platform for people to share their stories, whether they are the family and friends of someone suffering, whether themselves they are actively suffering with addiction or they're in recovery. But I realized that these stories just weren't being told. And because they weren't being told, especially on social media, everyone was still holding their stigmatized views. So I thought if I could share a story, you can see a little bit of yourself in that person and realize, hey, like these people are just, they're, just like my friend, or they're just like my brother, or they're just like my mom, and see themselves in that person and realize like this is such an issue because people are dying every single day and we need to figure out we need to sort of raise our hand and say, hey, like I volunteer, I want to help, I want to learn more. So there's so many stories that have been told to me, and we've recently, with donations, been able to help a lot of people. I recently just I got a message from someone a couple of weeks ago saying that they are unable to go get the medication that they need. There's something called medication assisted treatment in addiction that has been shown to reduce the risk of an overdose. And these medicines are super important, but not only do they cost a lot of these clinics that they have to go to are far away from their city or whatever rural area they're living in. And a person messaged me saying like, hey, I am pregnant and I really don't want to use, but I cannot afford my medication and I actually don't have a car, there's no bus system, and I can't afford to get there. So the Alberta's Project was able to call her doctor's office, pay not only for her appointment, but pay for her Uber to and from her doctors so she could actually get the medicine that she need. And that story stuck with me because I continue to learn and realize people don't want to be in active addiction. There is no one who is in active addiction right now who says, yes, I actually want to be in this place. They want to get out. But a lot of people don't have the resources and the means to get themselves out. And that's where it's incumbent upon, nonprofits like me in the community to, kind of volunteer and help them, and realize that people are trying very hard at just a very difficult circumstances, and good people get stuck in bad circumstances.
Yeah, and I know based off that, another major issue that does come, even if they do have the resources to get the help, it's the stigma that exists around them actually reaching out is
Yeah.
a huge part of it. So
Right.
I'm sure you and your organization have seen a lot of people who were stuck in that stigma. What sort of effects have you seen with it, and what sort of harm can we see with such stigma existing around?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you know what, like, to be honest, that's all I see, and I even find myself checking myself once or twice to realize, like, "Hey, like, why are you thinking that way?" Right? Like, it's tough, and, the unfortunate thing that I've sorta seen is not only is there stigma from the outside community for people who don't get it, just like me a year ago, but there's stigma even from inside the community. When you have cancer, God forbid, you go to a specific doctor who deals with that specific type of cancer, and you do like it is, there's no debate about what you do, whether it's chemotherapy or whatever it may be. Like, it's just, you are sick, here's the course of action that we have to take. It's not controversial. When it comes to addiction, there are so many ways, which is really great, right? There are so many ways that someone can get better. Someone can get better from medicine, someone can get better through therapy, someone can go to a 12-step program, someone can go to a non-12-step program. There's so many options. But I have found in the past year or so of me doing this that each group thinks that they are the only way that a person can get better. And that stigma is loud. And it's tough because if you are someone who is suffering an active addiction and you want to get better, and you go to one group and that one group is saying, hey, well, if you don't like us, sucks for you, you're not going to get better and you're going to die with drugs or alcoholism if you don't stick with us, that's awful. And I can think of the story of one of my best friends who passed away, Reed McGregor, is the reason why I started the Alberta's Project. She went to a 12-step meeting and she was on medication assisted treatment at the time, and they basically shamed her for taking it. And thus, I think she wanted to get off of it, and she did. And I really do believe that if she was still on the medicine, she would likely still be alive. But the whole point is, aren't we supposed to support the person no matter what? There is no right way to do things. There's the wrong way by telling people not to do things, but every person who's in active addiction is going to have their own recovery journey, which is great, right? There is not a one size fits all. But because there's not a one size fits all, there's a lot of stigma with even in the community of, oh, no, I did it this way. I got sober this way. You have to do this way, or you have to take medicine, or you have to go to this meeting. And it's tough because you're spinning around trying to figure out what's right. And that's already like a full time job. And from outside the community, no wonder why no one gets it, because we don't have one voice. We have 10 or 15 different siloed voices that are telling you this is the only way that, someone can get better. And that's tough. And that stigma is just coming from misunderstanding. And I really think that if we educate the wider public to realize it is a disease and all the intricacies dealing with it, I think people are much more likely to come forward. But again, like it's a big issue, and it's something that unfortunately is not going to be fixed overnight. But it's going to take podcasts like these and other organizations that are starting to kind of move the needle to the right on the right path.
Yeah, and on that specific note as well, like I wanted to ask, I know you mentioned that there are multiple ways to get treatment and such,
Mhm.
but on another note as well, there's so many people out there thinking they're doing good, but providing essentially unlicensed medical advice and such for something that is clearly a disorder or a disease that
Mhm.
should be resolved by a medical professional at that time. Although they might be good intentioned,
Right.
like you said, if not treated properly for the individual itself, can lead to negative consequences, and for most cases of addiction, can lead to death. So, how would you say people should approach uh, helping people with addiction when they're
Yeah.
not a licensed professional? And how can we recognize who the proper form of help is to help give the treatment?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And I still think about that every single day. So, like, I think about myself. Thank God I have never been in active addiction. I am not in recovery myself. So, no matter what, I will never know it as well as someone who's dealt with it, right? That's just by nature of it. However, it is up to people like me to educate myself. So, for example, in the Albertus Project, a lot of what we do is providing resources. So, there's something called Smart Recovery, which is a different take on the 12-step program. It focuses a lot on like self-reliance, and there aren't sponsors, but it's just a different way of going about doing things for recovery. And all recovery groups have been proven to be equally effective. So if you go to one specific recovery group, you are going to likely have the same outcomes if you go to a 12-step program or recovery Dharma or whatever it may be. So I think the most important thing is for you as a friend or a family member, a loved one of someone who's suffering, for you to educate and canvas all the options. What's really good is the Albertus Project has sort of put that together online, so you can kind of go to our website and take a look. But show your loved one, hey, listen, I'm seeing that there is an issue. I want to help you. And I don't want you to feel like you're stuck in the box. Here are all the different things you could do to get better. There's medicine, there's, inpatient, there's outpatient, there's different recovery groups. Like there are so many things that that person can do. And I think the most important thing is for you to know it, because the people who are suffering often don't know that there are options. So I know a story of a friend whose family member was suffering, and he had a recurrence of use. So he was sober for a while and then wasn't anymore. And he just didn't want to be in active addiction, but he basically said, I'm not going back to inpatient treatment. I hated it, so I don't want to get better. All that loved one had to do was realize, hey, that person that you're my family member doesn't have to go back to inpatient treatment that they hated in order to get better. So in that instance, it would be important to say, hey, blah blah blah, actually you do not have to go back to the place that you didn't like. Why don't you attend meetings? Or why don't we look into medicine? Or why don't we look into therapy? So it's incumbent upon us to know what is the latest of the land, like what is out there, what new recovery groups exist, so that way we can provide that information to our loved one. Because dealing in active addiction, from my understanding, is so, it's like a full-time job. That is all you're thinking about. So that person is not going to have the time to research options. And it's also scary, right? The more that you're educated, the more you're able to help your loved one make the best decision, right? So that's why it's really important that I suggest for anyone who's trying to help someone, you are not a licensed professional, so don't go mandating anything, because that person's going to want to have to get better. But if you know the lay of the land in your area, whether it's a church offering services, it's the local doctor, whatever it is, you know, and you can say, hey, loved one, there's this you can go to, there's that you can go to, there's this medicine you can take. So it's just about educating yourself so your loved one can feel comfortable knowing that they can rely on you and rely on the medical or social professionals in the community.
Yeah, for sure. And you brought up a really good point about the education itself. So how I know people don't actively come out to listen to such podcasts and such as much as we would want them to and
Right.
everything. So how would you say that we need to approach the education of such issues for the general public?
Yeah.
Would it be through like in high school in the health class teaching it there, or would it be, is there any other way that you recommend actually bring this topic into society?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Nick. So I have a lot of thoughts on that. I love what you just said, like high school. Like I think of something called Narcan or naloxone. That can save someone's life if they are dealing with an opioid overdose. It's a nose spray. I mean, it's an injection too, but it's commonly a nose spray. Where if you see someone who is passed out from an overdose, this is how you can revive them, by spraying this Narcan into their nose. I recently, my nonprofit, and a lot of my board just got trained on that, and we offered that training a couple of weeks ago. Um, I never knew how to use that. How, like, why do high schools or whatever colleges not teach you? It's like CPR. It is something that everyone should be carrying around in their purse or their wallet or whatever, their pocket. And it's something we should all know. So I think it's incumbent upon high schools to really start, even in elementary school, and I'm not saying going into detail, but really like putting some coursework together to say, hey, this is addiction, right? Because if you start at a young age and you start like teaching that there isn't a stigma, the other important piece to this too is in terms of like the school curriculum aspect is, when we're young, we're taught that doing drugs is bad and people who associate or do drugs are also bad. That in itself is bad. That's like not good. We don't want that, because what happens is, I know there was a couple, like, kids who did drugs in high school or college or whatever. I like stayed away from them thinking that they're like bad people because of them choosing to do drugs. Like, that isn't a one-to-one equation, and that is not something that I should be thinking, but that's just how I was brought up and the world around me works, right? So we need to stop teaching kids that doing drugs itself is bad, because then people aren't going to want to come forward. We need to start from a very early age, at least saying, hey, you are in your lifetime, in probably in high school, going to come across drugs or alcohol, whatever it may be. And the most important thing to teach our kids is how to use it safely, and how to support someone and how to support themselves, when to come forward, what to look for if they think there's an issue, how to get help. That's what we should be teaching. But if we're telling our kids just don't do it, that's stupid, because we know they're going to do it and then they're going to feel ashamed about coming forward. So that's on that. In terms of how do we also educate the wider public, I think it goes, because we're not doing it in schools right now. I think social media is a really good tool. I think about myself. I'm a young millennial and I get a lot of my information online. So what needs to happen in what we're trying to do with the Albertus Project is to start putting that information online, like on Instagram, on Facebook. And I know my attention span is really, really short, and I know everyone else's is. So it's important to put the most valuable information in like a graphic or online in a resource, like make it visually appealing and alluring, and people will at least start seeing that on their social media, right? Like I'm sure, Nick, you log into Instagram or Facebook, whatever it is, and you'll once in a while, it's not like super rare to see something about mental health, right? You'll see something about anxiety, about depression, mental health awareness day, all that sort of stuff. So that started to permeate our minds, which is really good. That doesn't exist with addiction. People aren't seeing that on their timeline. So my sort of idea is, let's start putting this stuff online. Let's start putting the word addiction recovery into different posts and graphics online. So at least it's not like once in a blue moon when someone sees this stuff and they start to get used to the idea of this is a thing, this exists, and you shouldn't be scared of it. Because if you don't hear of something, you're scared of it just by nature, right? That's how we are as humans. I was scared of addiction. I didn't know anything. And I think if we start to push the narrative of like, this is what addiction is, this is what addiction isn't, like dispel those myths online using social media, I think that's also another way to quickly educate the public, or at least make them not as scared as probably the public is now about it.
Yeah, for sure. And on this note as well, like I know that many of the things that the best metaphor I can actually think of is to sex ed classes that were
Right.
recently brought up in the last 15, 20 years, essentially when I was growing up. They were
Mm-hmm.
first introduced. They had huge amounts of stigma from whether it be the
Yes.
religious
Yes.
communities or the uh, cultural stigmas and such. But at the end of the day, it's very important to teach kids about if you're going to do it, you got to use the protection, or else you'll get consequences like you'll get have children which are 18 years responsible, you can get STDs and such. Same thing.
Yeah.
I think having that same kind of education in the schools
Exactly.
would be just as important. But
Right.
do you expect a similar kind of pushback that the sex ed classes had for these kind of classes, or would there be
Yeah.
different complexities that we can imagine?
Yeah, you know what? You're probably dead on that there is going to be pushback. Like, it's just such a this is such a tough, delicate subject, and I find because like all of us are hyper aware of everything, like on social media and the news, like the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be. To me, right? Like I think of something called harm reduction, which is basically like reducing harm, like supporting people who are using drugs so like they don't die, right? But that's somehow controversial. Well, tell me how is we use harm reduction every single day. When we ride a bike, we're using a helmet. When we drive a car, we're using a seatbelt. People aren't like, well, don't drive a car and you won't die. People are like, no, drive a car and just wear a seatbelt. So it's like, it's crazy to me. I think of harm reduction, like education in schools is a harm reduction measure to make sure that people are educated. So I think it would be controversial. It's kind of crazy that it would be because we're just teaching our kids. We're not teaching our kids, yeah, go do drugs, but we're also not teaching our kids don't do drugs. We're saying, here is the information that you need to make an educated decision, and if you need help, this is how you can get it. If you see someone overdosing, this is how you can save their life. It's practical, real world life skills that everyone needs. I literally, I cannot believe that I am 25 and in 2021 was only when I learned how to use Narcan. That should be in schools and that should not be controversial. I think there will be pushback, but I think once people actually understand, like it's an education thing and actually going to save people's lives. I don't think it will be as controversial. I think no matter what, if you're doing something right, someone's always going to hate on it. But that's why our educators, our principals, our school boards need to really like take a stand and say, no, like we are going to be a part of like fixing this. We're going to be part of the solution rather than just sitting idly by and not being proactive about it.
Yeah, and like I think the actual education of or the perception should be kind of like the same thing. Like the best way to not get the harmful consequences of the
Exactly.
drugs are
Right.
is not doing it itself. But if you need to do it or choose to do it, these are the consequences, make your mind right now. Because like it goes in, I grew up in the South Asian community where
Mhm.
like you got to sit down doctor, lawyer, or failure kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
And when I was prescribed Adderall for ADHD and brought it in,
Mhm.
they're like, oh, yo, you got to use it so you can turn into like you'll be a god of studying and such. And like even if you
Right,
didn't,
right.
brother, I'm prescribed this for like an actual medical disorder. What do you find so cool about this? Like, so just I think changing the perception of various drugs
Agreed.
basically is very vital, especially in Asian cultures where like things like booze or drugs or even Adderall are seen as, yo, if you use it, you're gonna ace your SATs or you're gonna get your
Mhm.
GMR scores out of the roof.
Mhm.
And I just think that kind of perception is what's currently existing is extremely harmful.
Yeah, I agree. And perceptions are like everything, right? Like someone's perceptions are reality, right? If everyone thinks something, whether it's true or not, it sort of starts to become true. So that's what's happening with addiction and mental health, right? Like, oh, this is bad. A lot of people think it's bad. It becomes bad, right? So it's incumbent upon as many. Really it's incumbent upon all of us, but to educate ourselves, right? Because that is the missing link to all of this. And I just think about holy smokes how much I've learned in 12 months. I learn something new every day. I'm not afraid to say it. Definitely don't know everything, and I'm certainly never going to be an expert. But if we start having these conversations and start being like, well, what do you mean by harm reduction? Or, well, what do you mean by A, B, and C? We're at least showing goodwill that we're trying to work and understand things, right? It's like racism, right? Like, I am white. Thank God I have never experienced racism. But it's also incumbent upon me to learn what it is and how to be an ally to those people of color. It's incumbent upon me. It's not incumbent upon a person of color to teach me. Same thing with addiction. It's not incumbent upon the addiction community to teach you. You should be taking the proactive strategies to try to figure out how to support them. Again, it doesn't always work like that because we're all busy and blah, 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 which is part of the reason why I do what I do to kind of make it as easy as possible. So even if someone spends 5 minutes on my Instagram page, hopefully they'll be able to take away something about addiction that will better their perception of what it really is.
For sure. And on that note as well, I know like it's very difficult for people to reach the help and change their perception, like especially in a country where we think healthcare is free, oh, healthcare is free, but in reality, it's not. Like getting the support here,
Right,
even in Canada, costs money, which in Toronto rent prices might not always be the most accessible.
right.
So I think the medical industry also has a responsibility to help people out here. And
Yes.
what do you think the ideal system would be for the medical system to open up to actually accept more people to provide the
Yeah.
assistance for?
No, that's a good question. I think part of it is I think about like Toronto specifically. I think about the world. Okay, so I'll just talk about the US for a sec. There's like 24 million people that are estimated to be suffering from addiction. Okay, 24 million people. There are just 3,000 addiction medical professionals. That's insane. You have 24 million and then you have 3,000. Like, that's astonishing. And I know the numbers might even be worse in Canada. Like, you don't have as many people suffering just by nature of the population, but I'm sure you have less than 3,000 medical professionals who
Yeah,
are specializing in addiction. So I know one thing that I think is really important, and I've talked about this before, but is incentivizing students, like students who are studying medicine, incentivizing them to choose addiction medicine as their path of work. And we can do that through like, cutting down their loans or not making school so expensive or paying for this or paying for that. Like, we need to start offering incentives for more medical professionals to study addiction. It's not the sexy, cool heart surgeon stuff that everyone's like, oh my God, that's great. But it's such a needed profession, and we just don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough nurses. Like, we just don't have enough. So I think what the medical profession industry needs to do is start incentivizing people going down that path. And I think too, Well, I know for a fact that a lot of doctors, believe it or not, and this is something I didn't understand till like 6 months ago, just because you're a doctor does not mean you understand addiction. Frankly, there's been many studies on how stigmatized the views of regular GP doctors are, and that's nuts. Like they themselves, I'm not going to say overarching, but a lot of them just don't get it, even though they're smart doctors. So I think what also needs to be had too is like, like in school, you have to take certain requirements, right? Like you have to take a math, you have to take the two sciences, whatever it is. I think in order to be a doctor or whatever you're practicing, you have to take like an addiction 101 course. And I think by baselining that education for every single medical professional is so important. So that way, when they are, doing their studies, they at least have some sort of baseline education of what addiction is and what it isn't, and how to support someone. Because I know a lot of people will go to their doctor and talk about addiction and they feel stigmatized and the doctor doesn't understand them. So if we start to educate at like while they're in school, I think that that's also a key to solution to the problem.
For sure. And I know time's coming close, but I want to ask one last question to summarize what we discussed today. So let's say an audience member, we'll call him Bill,
Mhm.
is listening to this episode and he's really inspired to seek help, and he is suffering from some issues that he would like to resolve. What is the best way for the audience member Bill to get the support he would need?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it really depends on where you're at, and I wish like I had the answer for every like city in the world and whatever. But what I would say is go on. I mean, there's so many things, but start to research the options. I have a bunch of options listed on our website under resources, but just look online. Start to search 12-step program. Start to search recovery dharma, smart recovery. Those are a bunch of the different treatment, recovery groups. Start to search medication assisted treatment. Start to search what doctors are in your area that would prescribe you medication assisted treatment. Start looking at who you could potentially speak to in terms of therapy. There's psychologists, there's psychiatrists, and there's social workers. There are so many options. So the first thing that I would do is you can get better and you will get better. It's going to take time and it's going to take effort on your part, but kudos for that. Take the time to research the lay of the land where you're at, the landscape of addiction, see who could help you, and then reach out to either it might be easier for you to reach out to a friend. It might be easier for you to reach out to a doctor directly. But starting at one of the recovery groups, I have to tell you, is probably the most helpful because it's people who are in your same exact boat who are relying on like the community that they're in to get help. So start taking a look at all the different websites for the recovery options, and those people will be an incredible ally. You'll be able to talk to them about what you're going through. They might be able to suggest a doctor or a psychiatrist or whatever it may be. So just start doing preliminary research and then probably go to one of those different groups. Try out a bunch of them. Don't just stick to one. See what fits you best. And know that you can recover and get better. There's so many people who have very fulfilling lives and are helping others who are in your position right now. So that's exactly what I would say to them.
For sure. And I'll be posting various links for this as well in the description. And I'll be posting the link
Awesome.
for Alberta's project as well in the description, so they can also come onto your site and take a look.
Cool.
And also as a concluding note as well, I know you guys are a not-for-profit organization. So for the holidays, I'll be making a donation on my front, and I do encourage the audience to make a donation as well because it will really help someone in need.
Thanks, Nick. That's awesome. Yeah, I super appreciate that. Yeah, those donations right now are going towards people to actually get the pay for their doctor's appointments and pay for their medicine and their transportation to and from. We've been able to help a lot of people right now. So thank you so much, Nick, for doing that. And yeah, if anyone else has the means to donate and can, I encourage you to do so.
Yeah, and I'll also encourage you, Alex, to provide any other resources and such that people can actually reach out to. And if
Yeah.
you message it to me, I'll put in the description here as well,
Awesome.
so people can reach out.
Cool.
But
That
thank
sounds
you,
perfect.
Yeah, and so thank you for coming on. And I just want to take a brief moment to ask if there's any concluding statements or a summary that you would like to give for the audience on this topic.
Yeah, no, just want to thank you so much, Nick, for having me on. I really appreciate it. And to, yeah, know anyone listening, just know that, you can recover. People do it. It's tough. But there is so many people, including Nick and myself, who are going to be right in your corner to support you. So just know that things can get better. So I appreciate it, Nick.
For sure. And on that note, happy holidays, guys. I'll be definitely posting this before the holidays start, but again, it's the holidays, so no complete guarantee. But on that note, thank you guys, and thank you for watching as well.